On a silent night, a widow returns to the old family mansion, not imagining what awaits her. Instead of a welcome, she finds dark corridors, half-open doors, and a plan to remove her from her own history. But what seemed to be her end becomes the beginning of a revelation that will change everything. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching us from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you will ever hear in your life. The fine Tuesday night rain in London created a silver veil over the car windows as it slowly ascended Pine Street in the Kensington Gardens district. Helen Montgomery watched from the window the centuries-old trees that lined that exclusive avenue, their canopies dancing under the damp wind that heralded another storm. At 68, she knew every curve of that path, every imposing gate, every high wall that hid the mansions of London's businessmen and traditional families. But that night, something different pulsed in her chest, a restlessness she couldn't name. The driver, Mr. George, a trusted man who had served the family for more than 20 years, looked in the rearview mirror and asked with a cautious voice if she would like him to announce their arrival. Helen denied with a gentle wave of her hand. It wasn't necessary. After all, this was her home. The mansion that she and Mark, her late husband, had bought in the 80s, when Montgomery Construction began to emerge as one of the capital's leading developers. Every brick of that building carried memories, sweat, victories, and also tears. It had only been 6 months since Mark had passed away, 6 months since the man who had built an empire by her side, who shared every important decision with her, who loved her with a silent and firm intensity, had closed his eyes for the last time. Helen still felt his emptiness in the bed, the smell of the coffee he prepared on Sunday mornings, the sound of his deep laugh echoing through the library. But life didn't stop, and she had learned over decades of building dreams in concrete and steel that stopping meant crumbling. The car stopped in front of the electronic gate. Mr. George waited for the automatic opening and slowly drove down the Portuguese stone driveway that led to the main entrance. The 3-story facade, with its smoked glass windows and balconies adorned with white hydrangea planters, remained imposing even in the rain. The exterior lights were on, but something about their arrangement seemed strange. Only a few windows glowed on the second floor. The rest of the house was plunged into an unusual gloom for that hour. Helen got out of the car even before Mr. George could open the door. She had always been like that, independent, agile, determined. She wore a navy blue tailored suit, a discreet pearl necklace, and her grey hair was pulled back in an impeccable bun. She was not a woman who appeared fragile, and yet in recent months she had noticed different looks from her children, whispers interrupted when she entered rooms, and abruptly ended phone calls. She climbed the marble steps of the entrance and rang the doorbell. Minutes passed. Strange. Someone always answered quickly. She rang again. Then finally the door slightly opened, but it wasn't Mrs. Larson, the usual housekeeper. It was Joanna, the young employee who took care of cleaning the suites. Joanna's face was pale, her eyes wide. She looked at Helen with an expression that mixed relief and terror. Before the matriarch could ask anything, Joanna placed her index finger over her lips, asking for silence. Then, with a swift gesture, she pulled Helen inside and carefully closed the door, avoiding any noise. Helen frowned. What was happening? Joanna held her arm with unusual force and whispered, so low that it was barely audible, "Mrs. Montgomery, you shouldn't be here. They weren't expecting you today." "Who wasn't expecting me? What are you talking about?" Helen tried to keep her voice low, but confusion and indignation mingled. "Your son and Mrs. Clarissa. There are people in the house. They are in the study with lawyers, doctors, I don't know. You need to hear what they are saying before you show yourself." Helen felt her heart race. Clarissa was her daughter-in-law, married to Matthew, her youngest son, a woman of impeccable appearance, always dressed in designer clothes, perfectly brushed blonde hair, nails polished in neutral tones. With a degree in administration, Clarissa had joined the Montgomery family 7 years ago, bringing with her an ambition that Helen had initially admired. After all, a determined woman was something she respected, but over time, that ambition had revealed darker nuances. Joanna led Helen down a side corridor, away from the main staircase. The lights were off and they walked almost blindly, guided only by the distant glow coming from the upper floor. Helen felt the tension in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "Mrs. Larson found out by chance," Joanna continued, still whispering. "She overheard Mrs. Clarissa talking on the phone yesterday about documents, about transferring the company presidency to Mr. Matthew, about getting a medical report saying that you are no longer fit to manage anything." Helen stopped walking. Her blood ran cold. "What?" "It's true, Mrs. Montgomery. Mrs. Larson told me this morning, distraught. She tried to call you all day, but your cell phone was out of range. Mrs. Clarissa said you would only return tomorrow morning from your trip to Edinburgh, that today was the perfect night to finalize everything." The trip to Edinburgh. Helen had gone to visit suppliers, negotiate contracts for a new venture she was planning. She was indeed supposed to return only the next morning, but one of the meetings had been cancelled and she had decided to come back earlier. A last-minute decision. One of those coincidences that life offers when least expected. They climbed a narrow service staircase that led to the second floor. Helen felt the weight of her years in each step, but also a growing determination. How dared they? How could her own son, to whom she had given everything, conspire against her? In the upper corridor, Joanna stopped in front of a carved wooden door. It was the side entrance to Mark's study. The room he had loved so much, where he had spent nights studying projects, closing deals, dreaming of the company's future. Now muffled voices came from within. Joanna pressed her ear to the wood and signaled for Helen to do the same. Clarissa's voice was unmistakable, firm, controlled, calculating. "Dr. Miller, do you confirm that the report is ready? We need it signed today. Tomorrow morning, the documentation needs to be filed at the registry office and company's house." A deeper male voice replied, "Everything is as agreed, Mrs. Clarissa. The report attests to severe depressive disorder, loss of discernment for civil acts, need for comprehensive medical supervision. Based on this, the interdiction will only be a formality." Helen felt her legs weaken. Interdiction. They wanted to declare her incapacitated, to remove her not only from the company, but from her own life, to turn her into a decorative figure, perhaps locked away in some private clinic where she could be forgotten. Matthew's voice then emerged, lower, hesitant. "But Mother will react. She won't accept this. She has always been so firm." "Matthew, darling, we've talked about this 1,000 times." Clarissa's voice changed tone, becoming softer, almost maternal. "Your mother hasn't been the same since your father passed. You yourself have seen how confused, how forgetful she has been. The other day she even forgot an important meeting with investors. That's not normal for her." "But I don't know if—" Matthew's voice trailed off. "Do you want to protect her or do you want to see her destroy herself?" Clarissa slightly raised her tone, but still maintained control. "Your father left you this responsibility. He trusted you to take care of the family, the company, everything. And caring, sometimes, means making difficult decisions. You are the man of the house now. You need to act like one." Silence. Helen imagined her son probably sitting in that leather armchair that had belonged to his father, his face in his hands torn between loyalty to his mother and the subtle manipulation of his wife. Another man spoke, his voice more formal. "Mr. Matthew, the documents for the transfer of the presidency are already prepared. All that's needed is your signature, and Mrs. Clarissa's as vice president. As of tomorrow, Montgomery Construction will officially be under new management. Mrs. Montgomery will remain a shareholder, of course, but without deliberative power." "And what about Beatrice?" Matthew asked, mentioning his older sister. "Beatrice has been out of the country for 2 years," Clarissa quickly replied. "She chose an academic career instead of the company. She no longer has an active link with the business, and let's be honest, she never showed real interest in the construction company. She was always more emotionally connected to her mother than to the business." Helen felt rage boil. Beatrice, her eldest daughter, was in France, doing a postdoctorate in architecture. She was brilliant, sensitive, determined, but after her father's passing, she had chosen to process her grief from a distance, immersing herself in academic work. The two spoke weekly by video call, but Helen had never mentioned the strange changes she perceived at home. She didn't want to worry her daughter. "So it's settled," the lawyer concluded. "Tomorrow at 9 in the morning, be at the registry office. I will bring the complete documentation. Dr. Miller will provide the medical report before that. And then we will begin the procedures for voluntary admission." "Voluntary?" Matthew questioned. "On paper, it will be voluntary," Clarissa explained coldly. "Your mother will sign the documents believing she is going to a rest retreat, something we will recommend with great affection and concern. She trusts you, Matthew. She will accept." Helen could no longer contain herself. She turned to Joanna and whispered firmly, "Where is Mrs. Larson?" "In her room waiting," Joanna replied. "Go there. Tell her to call Beatrice, now. No matter the time zone, tell her everything, absolutely everything. And tell her I need my daughter here as soon as possible." Joanna nodded, her eyes glistening, and disappeared down the corridor. Helen stood there, leaning against the door, listening to every word of that monstrous meeting, listening to how they were destroying her legacy, her dignity, her life. And as she listened, something within her rekindled. It wasn't blind rage. It was something more, powerful. It was the strength of someone who had built an empire brick by brick, who had faced economic crises, corporate sexism, business betrayals. It was Helen Montgomery's strength, and she would not be extinguished so easily. The meeting ended with promises of secrecy and final arrangements. Helen heard footsteps approaching the door. Quickly, she retreated into a small alcove between two antique cabinets that decorated the corridor. She stood there, motionless, as the lawyer and the supposed doctor left the study, accompanied by Clarissa to the main staircase. "Remember, Dr. Miller," Clarissa said as they descended, "this report is crucial. It needs to be incontestable. We cannot leave room for appeals or questioning. Don't worry. I have years of experience with this type of document. I have assisted other families in delicate situations. As age advances, such measures are necessary to protect assets." Helen clenched her fists. Protect assets? As if she were a nuisance, a threat to the very money she had helped build. As if her existence were an obstacle to be removed. When the voices faded, she returned to the study door. Now only Clarissa and Matthew were inside. Helen could hear her son's heavy breathing, a tired sigh. "You did the right thing," Clarissa was saying, and Helen imagined her hand on Matthew's shoulder. "Your father would be proud. You are protecting his legacy." "Would he be?" Matthew's voice was choked. "Would father approve of this?" "Your father was always practical. He built all this thinking about the family's future. And the future is you now. Your mother had her time. Now it's our turn." Helen closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. Then, with a calm that surprised even herself, she opened the door. The sound of the doorknob turning made Clarissa and Matthew turn their heads abruptly. The expression on her daughter-in-law's face was one of absolute shock, as if she were seeing a ghost. Matthew paled, sprang to his feet, knocking over some papers that were on the table. "Mother, you shouldn't—" he stammered, unable to form a complete sentence. Helen entered the study with firm steps. She closed the door behind her. She walked to the mahogany desk where Mark had spent so many nights, where decisions that changed the city were made, where dreams turned into skyscrapers. Shouldn't what, Matthew? Shouldn't I be in my own house? Or shouldn't I discover that my own son is planning to institutionalize me and steal everything I've built? The silence that settled in the room was cutting. Clarissa quickly recovered from the initial shock. Her face assumed a mask of rehearsed concern. "Mrs. Montgomery, it's nothing like that. We were just discussing ways to help you. You've been so overwhelmed, so—" "Don't you dare!" Helen's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. "Don't you dare speak to me as if I were a confused child or a senile old woman. I heard every word of this disgusting meeting. Every lie, every sordid plan." Matthew took a step forward, his hands extended in a conciliatory gesture. "Mother, let me explain. It's not what it looks like." "Then explain it to me, son." Helen stared Matthew in the eyes, and he averted his gaze. "Explain how you, who nursed at my breast, whom I raised, educated, supported in every difficult moment of your life, are here conspiring to lock me up in an asylum based on false reports. It's not an asylum, it's a resting clinic. Clarissa tried to intervene, but Helen ignored her completely. Her eyes remained fixed on her son. Matthew, look at me. He obeyed reluctantly. Tears were already streaming down his face. Your father would not be proud. Your father would be ashamed, because he knew me. He knew I am capable of carrying this company on my back alone if necessary, just as I did by his side for 40 years. Mother, I just wanted to... Matthew's voice broke. You wanted what? To be a man? To take control? Helen took a step towards him. A man is built with character, not with betrayal. Your father was a man because he had the courage to build, not to destroy. Clarissa, realizing she was losing control of the situation, tried a new approach. Mrs. Montgomery, with all due respect, you need to understand that age brings natural limitations. No one is questioning your history or your past abilities, but the present demands that I shut up while you steal my company. Helen finally looked directly at her daughter-in-law, and in that gaze were decades of experience, of battles won, of underestimated women who proved unbeatable. Do you think I don't know what you are, Clarissa? Do you think I don't see? Clarissa opened her mouth to reply, but Helen continued, relentless. I know where you came from. I know about your difficult childhood, the hardships you went through, and I admired that when you joined this family. I admired your strength, your determination to build something better. But what you built was a prison for yourself, a prison made of greed and insecurity. You know nothing about me, Clarissa retorted, and for the first time her voice trembled. I know everything. I am you, 30 years ago. The difference is that I built my empire without destroying anyone, without lying, without manipulating. Helen approached her daughter-in-law. And you will never achieve what I have achieved because you lack something essential, self-respect. Matthew sobbed. Mother, forgive me. I didn't mean to. You were just weak, Helen finished, and the harshness in those words hurt more than any shout. But weakness can be cured, malice not always. She then walked to the table, picked up the documents that were there, and began to tear them, one by one, with calculated calm. Clarissa tried to stop her, but Helen's gaze paralyzed her. This meeting is over, Helen declared, throwing the torn papers into the unlit fireplace. And tomorrow morning the three of us will sit down with this family's real lawyers, the ones who have worked for me for decades, and we will resolve this the right way. Mrs. Montgomery, you are making a mistake. Clarissa tried to regain control. The company needs young leadership, a modern vision. And it will have it, when I decide, in my time, in my way. Helen went to the door, opened it. Now get out of my study. This house is no longer a place for conspiracies. Clarissa walked past her with her chin held high, trying to maintain some dignity. Matthew, on the other hand, stopped in front of his mother. His eyes, red and swollen, pleaded for something she was not yet ready to give. Mother? Go, Matthew. We'll talk when you're ready to be a real man. He left, his shoulders slumped, seeming to carry the full weight of the betrayal on his back. Helen closed the door and leaned against it. Finally, alone, she allowed her own tears to fall. But they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of someone who had been tested, and against all expectations was still standing. Outside, the rain continued to fall over London, and inside the Montgomery mansion, a silent war had just begun. The night dragged on like an eternity inside the Montgomery mansion. Helen remained in the study until dawn, sitting in the leather armchair that still held the subtle scent of Mark's perfume. Through the wide window, she watched the first lights of day paint the meticulously cared-for gardens golden, the rose bushes he loved so much, the soapstone fountain where little birds came to drink water every morning. How many important decisions had been made in that room? How many dreams were born there? But now everything seemed stained by betrayal. The door opened gently. It was Mrs. Larson, carrying a tray with hot coffee, fresh bread, and cut fruit. The housekeeper was in her early 70s with completely white hair, pulled back in a low bun, a face marked by time but illuminated by kind eyes. She had served the family since before Matthew's birth. She was more than an employee. She was part of the history of that house. "Mrs. Montgomery, you didn't sleep at all," Mrs. Larson said, placing the tray on the side table. "You need to eat, keep your strength up." Helen smiled tiredly. "Were you able to reach Beatrice?" "Yes, I did. Joanna called her around 3 in the morning here, which was about 8 in the evening in France. The girl was distraught. She said she's going to try to catch a flight today. Maybe she'll arrive tomorrow morning." Helen felt a momentary relief. Beatrice. Her eldest daughter, 34, had always been her emotional safe harbor. After her father passed, Beatrice had plunged into grief differently from her brother. While Matthew had tried to appear strong, taking on responsibilities perhaps too great for him, Beatrice had chosen geographical distance as a way to process the loss. But mother and daughter maintained a deep bond, long video calls, affectionate messages, unwavering complicity. "And them?" Helen asked, referring to Matthew and Clarissa. "They're in their room. I heard an argument during the night. Matthew was crying. Mrs. Clarissa tried to calm him down, but her voice was different, more controlled than usual." Helen picked up the coffee cup and brought it to her lips. The hot liquid went down her throat, bringing fleeting comfort. "Mrs. Larson, how long have you noticed something was wrong here?" The housekeeper sighed, sitting in a nearby chair. She would never have this freedom with Clarissa around, but with Helen, formality had always given way to mutual trust. "About 2 months, maybe." After Mr. Mark passed away, Mrs. Clarissa started having closed meetings with Matthew. She called lawyers, doctors, consultants I had never seen before. She would send me and the girls out of the house on those days, inventing excuses about special cleanings, renovations that never happened. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I tried, Mrs. Montgomery, but you were so immersed in your own grief, so busy keeping the company running by yourself. I didn't want to add more worry, and honestly at first I thought it was just Matthew trying to take on responsibilities, trying to be the man his father was." Mrs. Larson paused, her eyes welling up. "But then I overheard that phone call. Mrs. Clarissa talking about institutionalizing you, about getting reports, about taking over everything. And I knew I had waited too long." Helen reached out and affectionately touched the housekeeper's arm. "You warned me at the right time. If I hadn't come back last night, maybe they would have succeeded. Maybe I would wake up this morning as a prisoner in my own life." Both were silent for a moment, the weight of that possibility hanging in the air. Then Helen stood up. She was 56 when Mark proposed to her, after years of business partnership. They married for love, but also for deep respect, for mutual admiration. Together they transformed a small construction company into one of the largest developers in the country. She knew every detail of the business, every strategy, every risk. She was not a woman who depended on her husband to exist. She was a woman who chose to share an empire, not receive it as a gift. "I'm going to take a shower and get dressed," Helen announced. "Then I need to go to the central office. I need to ensure that nothing has been altered without my knowledge in recent months." "Do you want me to tell Matthew?" "No. I want him to come to me when he's ready, if he ever will be." Helen went up to the master bedroom, the one she had shared with Mark for so many years. The king-size bed was still impeccably made, as always. She never slept there anymore. Since he passed, she had moved to one of the guest rooms, unable to face the vastness of that empty mattress. But her clothes, her belongings, everything remained there. She took a long shower, letting the warm water wash away some of the accumulated tension. She chose a custom-made charcoal grey suit, mid-heel shoes, discreet silver earrings. She styled her hair into an elegant updo, applied subtle but impeccable makeup. When she looked in the mirror, she saw the woman she had always been, determined, elegant, ruthless when necessary. She went downstairs and, passing through the living room, found Matthew. He was sitting on the beige linen sofa, hunched over, his hands covering his face. He wore a dark bathrobe, his hair disheveled, his beard unshaven. He seemed to have aged 10 years in one night. Helen stopped at the door. Part of her wanted to hug him, comfort him as she did when he was a child, and came home from school crying because other boys teased him. But another part, the part that had been betrayed, remained firm. "Mother." Matthew looked up when he noticed her presence. His eyes were swollen red. "I need to talk to you." "Then speak." He stood up, hesitant. "I know there's no excuse for what I did. I know you have every right to hate me. But you need to understand. I was lost. After Father died, I felt suffocated by expectations, by responsibility, by everything." Helen entered the room and stood by the window, her back to her son. Outside, the gardener trimmed the hedges. Life went on at its normal pace, indifferent to human dramas. "And you thought the solution was to lock me up?" she asked, her voice controlled but cutting. "It wasn't my original idea," Matthew murmured. "It was Clarissa who—" Helen turned sharply. "No, don't you dare put all the blame on her. You are an adult man, Matthew. You have a voice, you have a choice. You chose to believe her lies. You chose to sign those papers. You chose to invite those charlatan doctors into my house. I know," he raised his voice, desperate. "I know I was weak. But Clarissa, she's very convincing. She speaks in a way that makes everything seem logical, necessary, as if we were protecting you." "Protecting?" Helen let out a bitter laugh. "Matthew, I built this company before you were born. I faced crises that almost led us to bankruptcy. I survived sexism, prejudice, competitors who tried to destroy us. And you think I need protection against my own abilities?" He lowered his head. "You're right. You always are." "It's not about being right," Helen approached her son. "It's about respect. Your father respected me, Matthew. Even when we disagreed, even when we made mistakes, there was respect. And I expected the same from you. Clarissa said it was for my own good, that I needed to take my place as the man of the family." "Man of the family," Helen repeated thoughtfully. "Your father never needed anyone to make him feel like a man. He simply was. Because being a man is not about controlling, dominating, or underestimating others. It's about integrity." At that moment, Clarissa came down the stairs. Unlike her disheveled husband, she was perfectly dressed. A black sheath dress, hair pulled back in a high ponytail, impeccable makeup. But there was something different in her eyes. A hardness, a coldness that was no longer disguised. "Mrs. Montgomery," she greeted with a false reverence. "I imagined you would already be at the office, taking care of business." "I'm taking care of what really matters," Helen replied. "My family." Clarissa smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Family is an interesting concept. Sometimes protecting the family means making unpopular decisions. "Or perhaps," Helen retorted, "protecting the family means identifying who truly belongs to it." The silence that settled was tense. Matthew looked from one to the other, like a lost boy between two opposing forces. Clarissa took a step forward, raising her chin. "You may have thwarted our plans last night, but that doesn't change reality. The company needs young leadership. Investors are concerned about succession. Employees murmur about the future. You may be brilliant, but you are not eternal." "No one is eternal, Clarissa, but as long as I am alive and lucid, no one will steal what I have built." "Steal?" Clarissa let out a short laugh. "Matthew is your son. He has a right to what you built." "He does, and he will receive it at the right time, in the right way, not through betrayal and lies." Clarissa crossed her arms. "You know, I really admired you when I joined this family. I saw you as an example. But time I realized something. You never truly accepted that others could be as capable as you. Beatrice fled to France because she couldn't stand living in your shadow. And Matthew, well, Matthew was always the son who would never be good enough." "Don't you dare speak of my daughter," Helen advanced, her voice low and dangerous. "And don't project your insecurities onto my relationship with my children." "Insecurities?" Clarissa laughed again, but there was a hysterical note. "I came from nothing, Mrs. Montgomery. I know what it's like to fight for every crumb. And when I finally gained a place in this family, I discovered that I would never truly be accepted. Because I'm not Beatrice, the perfect daughter. I'm not the continuation of the Montgomery legacy. I'm the outsider. Helen watched her daughter-in-law with renewed attention. There it was, finally, the truth. Beneath all the ambition, beneath all the manipulation, there was a deeply insecure woman, a woman who confused control with belonging, power with love. "Clarissa," Helen spoke, and her voice surprisingly softened. "You're right about one thing. You came from difficult circumstances, and I admire that. I admire your strength, your determination. But you made a fundamental mistake. You believed you had to destroy to build, that you had to erase me to exist." "Because it's true," Clarissa insisted, and for the first time, there was vulnerability in her voice. "In this family, there's no room for anyone who isn't a Montgomery by blood." "Then you should have fought to create that space, not to steal mine." Matthew, who until then had remained silent, finally spoke. "Clarissa, maybe Mother is right. Maybe we have—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Maybe we went too far." Clarissa turned to him and the mask of control finally cracked. "Too far? Matthew, everything I did, every plan, every lie was for us, for you, so you could have what you deserve." "But I don't deserve it this way," Matthew whispered, and there was a new clarity in his voice. "Not like this. Are you choosing her?" Clarissa's voice went up an octave. "After everything I've done for you, after supporting you when no one else believed in you." "She's my mother," Matthew replied, and tears again streamed down his face. "And I betrayed her, but I won't continue betraying her." Clarissa looked at her husband as if he were a stranger. Then she turned to Helen. "You won then, congratulations. You remain the queen of your little kingdom. But know one thing, this victory will come at a high price, because as long as you are here, commanding everything, your son will continue to be exactly that, a son. Never a man, never a leader. Always the shadow of the great Helen Montgomery." "Get out of my house," Helen ordered, and there was no anger in her voice, only an unwavering firmness. "With pleasure." Clarissa walked towards the stairs, but stopped on the first step. "But this isn't over. You'll see." She ran upstairs, and minutes later they could hear doors slamming, drawers opening. Clarissa was packing. Matthew sank onto the sofa again, his hands trembling. "Mother, I don't know what to say." Helen sat beside her son. For the first time since the discovery of the conspiracy, she touched him. She placed her hand over his. "You tell the truth. Just that. The truth about why you did what you did. The truth about who you want to be." "I want to be like Father, but I don't know if I can." "Your father also doubted himself," Helen revealed, surprising Matthew. "When we started the company, he was so afraid to fail, but he learned something important. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing despite the fear. What if I don't know what the right thing is? Then you ask. You seek counsel. You learn." Helen squeezed her son's hand. "But you don't lie. Never." They stayed there, side by side, as the sun fully rose in the London sky. Clarissa came down an hour later with 2 large suitcases. She didn't look at either of them. She simply called a taxi and left, the door slamming behind her with an echo that seemed to travel through the entire mansion. Matthew broke into sobs. "I loved her. I still do." "I know." Helen hugged him, and he nestled against her shoulder, as he did when he was a child. "But sometimes loving isn't enough. Sometimes we need to love with limits, with truth. How am I going to fix this? One day at a time. One right choice at a time." That afternoon, Helen went to the central office of Montgomery Construction, a glass and steel building in the heart of Oxford Street. Her employees greeted her with genuine respect, some with surprise to see her there on an unscheduled day. She went straight to the president's office, locked the door, and spent hours reviewing documents, contracts, and financial movements from recent months. And she found something. Subtle transfers of funds, scheduled meetings she hadn't authorized, merger proposals that had never passed her approval. Clarissa and Matthew had started moving pieces months ago, preparing the ground for a silent coup. Helen picked up the phone and called Dr. Alfred Kennedy, the family lawyer since the 90s, a white-haired man of unwavering integrity. "Dr. Kennedy, I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning and bring everything, corporate contracts, will, powers of attorney, everything related to the company's succession and governance." The lawyer's grave voice showed concern. "Has something happened, Mrs. Montgomery?" "A coup attempt happened, and I'm going to make sure it never happens again." When she returned home at dusk, she found Matthew sitting in the garden, looking at the stone fountain. She sat beside him. They remained silent for long minutes, listening to the sound of the water, the chirping of birds settling down for the night. "Mother, how do you do it?" Matthew finally asked. "Do what?" "To be so strong, to never falter." Helen smiled sadly. "I falter all the time, my son, but I falter out of sight. I cry in the bathroom, I scream in the car. I'm afraid in the dead of night, but when morning comes I get up, because that's what leaders do, not because they are invincible, but because they are necessary. I want to learn to be like that. Then you will learn. But at my pace, in my way, and when you are ready, not because someone forced you, but because you chose to." That night, Helen went up to her room and, for the first time since Mark had passed, lay down in their bed. She hugged the pillow that still vaguely held his scent, and she cried. She cried for the betrayal, for the pain, for the loneliness, but also for the strength she had discovered within herself, for the ability to forgive without forgetting, to love with limits, to lead with firmness. And as she cried, she knew that the next day would bring more challenges. Because Beatrice was arriving, and together, mother and daughter would have to rebuild what had been almost destroyed. But now, for the first time in months, Helen didn't feel alone. The war was not yet over, but the first battle had been won. Heathrow Airport buzzed with the typical hustle and bustle of Thursday mornings, hurried executives, families carrying colourful suitcases, tourists trying to decipher signs in Portuguese. Helen Montgomery stood near the international arrivals gate, her hands clasped over her leather purse, her heart beating with an anxious rhythm she hadn't felt in a long time. It had been 2 years since she had seen Beatrice in person. 2 years since her daughter had embarked for France, carrying with her a grief so profound from her father's passing that she needed distance to process it. Weekly video calls maintained the bond, but they didn't replace a hug, a look in the eyes, a physical presence. Then she appeared. Beatrice Montgomery crossed the gate with a carry-on bag slung over her shoulder, dark brown hair loose and slightly disheveled from the long journey, dark circles under her eyes, betraying sleepless hours, but her eyes, those brown eyes just like her father's, shone with determination. She wore jeans, a simple, white blouse, comfortable sneakers. At 34, she had the natural beauty of youth, mixed with the sophistication of someone who had lived in Paris. When their eyes met, everything else seemed to disappear. Beatrice dropped her bag and ran. Helen opened her arms. And there in the middle of the crowded airport, mother and daughter embraced like castaways, finally finding solid ground. "Mother," Beatrice whispered, her voice choked. "I'm so sorry for not being here." "You're here now," Helen replied, hugging her daughter tightly. "That's all that matters." They pulled apart, just enough to look at each other. Helen ran, her hands over her daughter's face, as if she needed to confirm it was real. Beatrice wiped tears from her own face and tried to smile. "Mrs. Larson told me everything on the phone. I couldn't sleep on the plane. I kept thinking about how Matthew could—" She paused, anger and sadness vying for space in her expression. "How could he do that to you?" "We'll talk in the car." Helen held her daughter's hand. "There's a lot you need to know." The journey from Heathrow to Kensington Gardens took almost 2 hours due to heavy traffic. Inside the car, Helen recounted everything in detail: the meeting she had witnessed, the plans for institutionalization, the false medical report, the confrontation, Clarissa's departure. Beatrice listened in silence, but her clenched fists revealed her suppressed fury. "I always suspected her," Beatrice finally said when Helen finished. "From day one. There was something about Clarissa that never seemed genuine to me, as if she was always playing a role." "She was," Helen agreed. the role of someone who belongs. And Matthew, where is he now? At home, devastated. Since Clarissa left, he barely leaves his room. He tries to talk to me, to ask for forgiveness, but the words always fail him. Beatrice looked out the window, watching London pass by in its familiar, chaotic beauty. Part of me wants to scream at him, shake him, ask how he could be so stupid. But another part just feels pity, because I know how manipulative Clarissa is, and I know how vulnerable Matthew has always been. He needs you too, Helen said softly. He needs the sister who always looked out for him. I don't know if I'm ready for that, Mother. No one is ready to forgive until they have to make the choice. When they arrived at the mansion, Matthew was sitting on the entrance steps as if waiting. Seeing the car approach, he stood up, hesitant. When Beatrice got out, brother and sister stared at each other for long seconds. Beatrice was the first to move. She didn't run to him, she didn't smile. She simply walked with firm steps, stopped in front of her brother, and slapped him across the face. The sound echoed through the silent garden. Matthew didn't react, just accepted it. Tears were already streaming down his face. "How dare you?" Beatrice hissed, her voice low but laden with emotion. "Our mother, the woman who raised us, who built everything we have, and you tried to lock her up." His voice came out strangled. "Don't call me that. You don't deserve to call me by my childhood nickname." Beatrice took a step back. "Do you know what I had to do to be here? Drop my research in the middle, catch an emergency flight, spend months of savings, all because my brother, whom I helped raise when mother and father worked late, decided to become a traitor?" "I'm sorry," Matthew sobbed. "I'm sorry. I was weak. I let her manipulate me." "She didn't manipulate you. She seduced you with the idea of power, and you liked it." Beatrice crossed her arms. "So don't come with excuses about manipulation. You knew what you were doing. You chose." Helen watched the scene with a broken heart, seeing her two children, who were once so close, now separated by so much pain, was harder than the betrayal itself. "Beatrice," Helen called softly, "let's go inside. The three of us need to talk." Her daughter obeyed, but not without casting one last cutting glance at her. "Brother!" They gathered in the living room, the same one where Helen had confronted Matthew and Clarissa 2 days earlier. Mrs. Larson served coffee and discreetly withdrew. Beatrice sat in an armchair, Matthew in another, distant from each other. Helen stood, watching her children. How many times had she dreamed of a family gathering like this, but not under these circumstances. Never like this. "You two are all I have," Helen began, her voice trembling slightly. "After your father passed, you became not just my children but my purpose, and seeing you destroyed like this, alienated like this, is worse than any betrayal I could have suffered." "Mother, I never meant to hurt you," Matthew murmured. I felt so lost without father, and Clarissa was there, saying she understood me, that she would help me be strong." "But to be strong, you had to destroy our mother," Beatrice retorted, her voice acidic. "What kind of logic is that?" There was no logic. Nothing has made sense since father died. Matthew finally raised his head, facing his sister. "You ran away, Bea. You went to France, immersed yourself in work, distanced yourself from everything. I didn't have that luxury. I had to stay, take over the company, deal with expectations, and I wasn't prepared." "No one was prepared," Beatrice replied, but her voice was already less harsh. "I ran away because I didn't know how to stay, because every room in this house reminded me of him, because I wasn't strong enough to face the emptiness, but I never ever would try to harm Mother. Because you're better than me. You always were." "No," Helen intervened firmly. "There's no better or worse here. There are two people who lost their father and dealt with the pain in different ways. Both wrong, both understandable." Beatrice turned to her mother. "I didn't commit any crime, Mother." "No, but you abandoned me at a time when I needed you, and that hurt too." The silence that settled was heavy, but necessary. Beatrice lowered her gaze, processing her mother's words. There was truth there, a truth she had avoided facing for 2 years. "I'm sorry," Beatrice whispered finally. "I thought I was protecting myself, But in reality, I was being cowardly. It wasn't cowardice. Helen sat between her two children. It was survival. Sometimes you need to step away to breathe. I understand that. But now you two need to understand something important. This family doesn't survive without unity. And unity doesn't mean an absence of conflicts. It means facing them together. Matthew looked at his sister. "B, can you forgive me someday?" Beatrice took a deep breath. "I don't know, but maybe we can try to rebuild something. Not for what we were, but for what we can be." It wasn't an emotional hug, it wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. And sometimes beginnings are more valuable than perfect endings. That afternoon, Helen gathered her two children in the study. On the mahogany table, she had spread documents, corporate contracts, company bylaws, powers of attorney, a will. Dr. Alfred Kennedy, the family lawyer, was present, sitting in a side chair with his time-worn leather briefcase. "You need to understand the extent of the problem," Helen began, pointing to one of the documents. "In the last 3 months, Clarissa and Matthew created a series of maneuvers that, if they hadn't been interrupted, would have gradually removed me. Transfers of minority shares to shell companies, meetings with investors without my presence, proposed statutory changes without my knowledge." Beatrice picked up one of the papers and examined it carefully. As an architect, she understood contracts and technical documents. "Is this a merger proposal?" "Yes," Dr. Kennedy replied. "A merger with Almeida Construction, a smaller competitor. The proposal would dilute Mrs. Montgomery's shares, transferring decision-making power to new partners." "And you signed this?" Beatrice looked at her brother, incredulous. "I signed without reading it properly," Matthew admitted, ashamed. "Clarissa said it was routine, a strategic expansion." "Matthew, this isn't expansion, this is a corporate coup." Beatrice threw the paper onto the table. "How could you be so naive?" "Because I trusted her," he replied, his voice breaking. "Because I thought she loved me." "Love doesn't do that," Helen said softly. "Love doesn't build empires on lies." Dr. Kennedy adjusted his glasses. "The good news is that these maneuvers were not completed. Mrs. Montgomery still holds 60% of the shares, with full decision-making power. But we need to act quickly to reverse what was started and protect the company against future attempts." "What do you propose, Mother?" Beatrice asked. Helen looked at her two children. "I propose total transparency. You two officially join the board of directors. Beatrice, you take over the projects and architecture department. Matthew, you handle the operational side, but both under my supervision, and both need to prove they deserve these positions." "I deserve a chance to fix what I did," Matthew said, and there was a new determination in his voice. "I don't want chances based on guilt," Helen retorted. "I want competence, I want dedication. I want you to be the professional I know you can be, not the boy who needs to compensate for mistakes." "Then I will be," Matthew promised. Beatrice, for her part, seemed hesitant. "Mother, I have my research in Paris, my life, there. And you can continue to have it. But you can also have a life here, a company to help build, a legacy to honor." Helen held her daughter's hand. "Your father always dreamed that you two would take over together. Not separately, not at war. Together." "And Clarissa?" Beatrice asked. "Will she simply accept that she lost?" "No," Helen replied with realism. "That's why we need to be prepared. Dr. Kennedy, what are our legal options?" The lawyer opened his briefcase. "Given that there was an attempted fraud, we can file an interdiction action against Clarissa, prohibiting her from approaching the company and the family. We can also file a lawsuit for attempted fraud, considering the false medical report, and, if necessary, we can request protective measures." "No," Matthew intervened. "No lawsuits. Please, she is my wife." "Was," Beatrice corrected. "She was your wife. Now she is a criminal who tried to destroy our family." "Even so," Matthew insisted, "I don't want to destroy her life. I just want her to stay away." Helen pondered. Part of her wanted complete justice, wanted to see Clarissa pay for every lie, every manipulation. But another part, the part that loved her. Son, despite everything, understood his request. Let's do this, Helen decided. Dr. Kennedy, prepare the interdiction documents. Clarissa is prohibited from approaching the company, the family, and any negotiations involving Montgomery Construction, but we will not file a criminal lawsuit for now. If she accepts peacefully, we'll end it here. If she attempts any retaliation, then we will take more severe measures. The lawyer nodded. It's a prudent approach. I'll arrange everything today. In the following days, the dynamic of the Montgomery family began to reorganize. Beatrice settled into the room that had been hers during adolescence, a bright space, overlooking the garden. She began visiting the office, reviewing projects, meeting teams, relearning the workings of the company that had helped build the family fortune. Matthew, in turn, immersed himself in work with an almost obsessive dedication. He arrived at the office before everyone else, left after everyone had departed. He reviewed contracts, participated in meetings, tried to prove, perhaps more to himself than to others, that he still had value. Helen observed everything with a mixture of hope and caution. Reconstruction was possible, but it would take time. Trust was not restored overnight. A week after Beatrice's return on Thai. A rainy Friday, the mansion's intercom rang. It was Mrs. Larson announcing a visitor. "It's Mrs. Clarissa," she said, her voice tense. Helen was in the library reviewing some documents. Beatrice was by her side, helping to organize papers. Both exchanged a look. "Send her in," Helen instructed, "but call Matthew too and Dr. Kennedy if he's still here." Minutes later, Clarissa entered the library. She looked different. Without her impeccable makeup, her hair simply tied back, wearing casual clothes. She seemed smaller, more fragile, almost vulnerable. "Mrs. Montgomery," she greeted, her voice lacking its former firmness. "Thank you for receiving me." "Don't thank me," Helen replied coldly. "You have 5 minutes." Clarissa looked around. Beatrice stared at her with ill-disguised contempt. Matthew, who had just entered, seemed torn between anger and something that still resembled affection. Dr. Kennedy remained seated, observing everything with professional attention. "I came to return this." Clarissa extended a folder. "These are all the documents I had related to the plan. Copies of contracts, merger proposals, information about the doctors I hired, everything." Helen took the folder but didn't open it. "Why?" "Because I lost," Clarissa replied simply. "And I'm not stupid enough to keep fighting a war that's already decided." "You think that's all?" Beatrice took a step forward. "You think you can just hand over some papers and everything's fine?" "No." Clarissa looked at her sister-in-law. "I know nothing is fine. I know I did unforgivable things. But I didn't come seeking forgiveness. I came to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" Helen asked. "I'll sign the divorce, relinquish any claim to assets or the company, accept the interdiction, and leave your lives. In return, you don't sue me. You let me start over in peace." "You don't deserve peace," Beatrice spat. The words. "I know." Clarissa finally showed real emotion, tears forming in her eyes. "But I also don't deserve total destruction. I made terrible mistakes. I let my ambition and insecurity consume me. But deep down, in some twisted part of my mind, I truly thought I was doing the right thing." "Doing the right thing doesn't include lying and manipulating," Helen retorted. "I know that now." Clarissa wiped her tears. "But at the time, I was so lost in my own need to belong, to be valued, that I distorted everything, and I'm sorry not for having lost, but for having hurt people who didn't deserve it." Matthew took a step forward. "Clarissa, did you ever love me? Truly?" She looked at her husband, and for the first time since she entered, a sad smile appeared on her lips. "I did love you, Matthew. I loved you the way I knew how to love, which perhaps wasn't the right way, but it was the only way I knew. And I'm sorry for involving you in all this. You didn't deserve it." "No one deserved it," he whispered. Dr. Kennedy stood up. "I have the agreement papers here. If Mrs. Clarissa signs them, we'll conclude everything today." Clarissa took the pen the lawyer offered, and without hesitation signed each page. When she finished, she looked one last time at the family she had once dreamed of truly joining. "Goodbye," she simply said, and left. The silence that followed was long. Matthew sank into an armchair, his hands covering his face. Beatrice approached the window, watching Clarissa get into a car and leave. Helen remained standing, holding the folder of documents. "Is it over?" Matthew asked, his voice muffled. "That part, yes," Helen replied. "But the new beginning is just starting." And that night, for the first time in months, the Montgomery family had dinner together. It wasn't a joyful meal, there was no laughter or happy memories shared, but there was presence, there was comfortable silence, there was the silent promise that, despite everything, they were still a family. 3 months had passed since Clarissa's departure. Spring had arrived in London, bringing with it longer days, flowers blooming in the gardens of the Montgomery mansion, and a renewal that seemed to transcend nature and also reach people. The jacaranda tree on the street blossomed in vibrant purple, as if the city itself silently celebrated the possibility of new beginnings. Helen woke up on a Monday morning with the sun streaming through the white linen curtains of the master bedroom. Yes, she had finally returned to the bed she had shared with Mark for so many years. The emptiness was still there, but it was no longer unbearable. It was a familiar presence, almost comforting, like a scar that marks the skin, but no longer hurts to the touch. She dressed carefully, choosing a moss-green pantsuit, discreet gold earrings, low-heeled shoes. At 68, she had learned that elegance was not in the height of the heel, but in the posture of the wearer. She went down to the dining room and found a scene that warmed her heart. Beatrice was sitting at the table, still in her pajamas, hair in a messy bun, drinking coffee while reviewing architectural plans on her tablet. Matthew was beside her, already dressed in a grey suit, taking notes in a pad. They were discussing a new venture, exchanging ideas, disagreeing on some points, but always with mutual respect. "Good morning, Mother." Beatrice looked up and smiled. That smile Helen had missed so much in recent years. "Good morning, daughter." Matthew. "Good morning, Mother." Matthew stood up and pulled out her chair for her. A simple gesture, but one that showed the subtle change that had been happening. He was learning that respect manifested itself in small acts, not in grand declarations. Mrs. Larson emerged from the kitchen with a tray of fresh fruit, warm bread, and freshly brewed coffee. "Mrs. Montgomery, did you sleep well?" "I did, Mrs. Larson. Better than in months." The housekeeper smiled, satisfied, and returned to the kitchen. Helen served herself, watching her children resume their discussion about the project. It was a residential development in the west end of the city, something that combined sustainability with accessibility, a concept Beatrice had brought from her research in France, and that Matthew was learning to implement with economic viability. "The thing is, solar panels increase the initial cost by 15%, Matthew explained, pointing to numbers on a spreadsheet. "Will buyers accept paying that?" "They will if they know they recover the investment in 5 years through energy savings," Beatrice countered. "It's a matter of market education, not reducing project quality. But 5 years is a long time for most people to think about. Then we educate them. We give talks, demonstrations, create simulation models." Beatrice was excited, her eyes shining. "Brother, we have a chance to be pioneers in this, to show that sustainable construction isn't a luxury for the rich. It's everyone's responsibility." Matthew smiled, and Helen noticed it was a genuine, unforced smile. "Okay, you convinced me. We'll include the panels." "Great. Then we need to talk to suppliers. I have contacts in Europe who can help us with technology." Helen gently intervened. "First of all, you two will present the complete project to me and the board. Nothing moves forward without formal approval." "Of course, Mother," they both replied in unison and laughed at the synchronicity. It was in these moments that Helen felt the true victory. It wasn't in Clarissa's expulsion, it wasn't in maintaining control of the company. The victory was there in those two human beings she had raised, finally working together, supporting each other, building something greater than their individual egos. After breakfast, the three headed to the central office. Traffic was chaotic as always, but Helen no longer cared. She used the time in the car to review emails, make calls, organize the day. Beatrice was in the back seat, still working on her tablet, while Matthew drove, focused. "Mother," Beatrice suddenly called, "there's something I need to tell you." Helen turned in her seat. "Go ahead." "I received an offer from the university in Paris. They want me to go back to complete my research and then take on a permanent professorship." Helen's heart tightened, but she kept a neutral expression. "And you want to go?" "I do, and I don't." Beatrice sighed. "My academic life is there, but my family is here. And I discovered that business can also be creative. It can also be a way to build a legacy. So what are you asking me? Permission to do both, spend 6 months here, 6 months there, work remotely when possible, not abandon the family, but also not abandon my dreams." Matthew, who had remained silent until then, spoke without taking his eyes off the traffic. "B, if you go, who's going to hold me when I start freaking out again?" It was a joke, but it carried truth. Beatrice reached out and touched her brother's shoulder. "You won't freak out again because now you know what really matters." "I approve," Helen decided, "but with one condition. You maintain active participation in the projects, video conferences, remote approvals, whatever is necessary. You are part of this company now, not as an obligation, but as a choice." Beatrice smiled, relieved. "Thank you, Mother." At the office, the morning passed with meetings, strategic decisions, contract signings. Helen watched with pride as Beatrice positioned herself in discussions, bringing innovative perspectives, challenging old ideas with respect but also with firmness. And Matthew, though still insecure at times, was learning to trust his own judgment, to make decisions without constantly seeking external approval. At lunchtime, the three went to an Italian restaurant near the office, a discreet place the family had frequented for decades. They sat at a back table, away from the curious glances of other business people. "You know," Helen began as they waited for their dishes to arrive, "when your father and I started Montgomery Construction, we had only a dream and a lot of courage. No significant capital, no important connections, just a desire to build something that would last." Beatrice and Matthew listened in silence. It was rare for Helen to speak so openly about the early years. "There were times when we almost went bankrupt," she continued. "Economic crises, cancelled contracts, betrayals by partners. But we survived because we trusted each other, because we knew that together we were stronger than any storm." "Mother, why are you telling us this now?" Matthew asked softly. "Because you need to understand something fundamental. Companies are important, money is necessary, professional success brings fulfillment. But none of that is worth anything if it destroys who you are in the process. Clarissa almost destroyed this family because she confused material conquest with personal value." "And you never succumbed to that temptation?" Beatrice questioned. Helen pondered before answering. "I had my moments. There were times when I worked so hard that I almost forgot how to be a mother, how to be a wife. Your father brought me back. He always reminded me patiently that building buildings was what we did, not who we were." The dishes arrived. Mushroom risotto for Helen, pesto pasta for Beatrice, lasagna for Matthew. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, each absorbed in their own thoughts. "Mother," Matthew finally spoke, his voice hesitant, "I still think about her sometimes, about Clarissa. I wonder how she is, if she's okay." "It's normal," Helen replied without judgment. "You loved her. Love doesn't disappear just because the person did something terrible. But I feel guilty for still caring." "Guilt is a useless emotion when it turns into paralysis," Beatrice intervened, surprising both of them. "You can care about her and still recognize that she hurt you. Both things can coexist." Matthew looked at his sister with gratitude. "When did you get so wise?" "Always have been. You were just too busy being manipulated to notice." She winked, lightening the phrase with humor. He laughed, a light, genuine sound. "Touché." That afternoon, back at the office, Helen gathered the entire board for a special presentation. Beatrice and Matthew had prepared the Sustainable Development Project together, and it was time to formally present it. The meeting room was full. Department directors, project managers, external consultants, all seated around the long glass table. Beatrice connected her laptop to the projector and began the presentation. She spoke passionately about bioclimatic architecture, about how the project respected the local microclimate, utilized natural ventilation, used recycled and recyclable materials. Matthew complemented with financial data, sales projections, marketing strategies. Together, they formed a formidable duo. When they finished, there was a silence. Then one of the oldest directors, a grey-haired gentleman named Albert, began to applaud. Others joined in. In a few seconds, the entire room was on its feet, applauding the two young Montgomery heirs. Helen watched with discreet tears in her eyes. Mark would be so proud. Her children, finally, were honoring the legacy he had left. "Approved," Helen declared when the applause ceased. "But I want weekly follow-ups, monthly reports, and participation in all important decisions. And I want you two to lead this project from start to finish, together." "Yes, Mother," they replied, and there was genuine joy in their voices. That night at the mansion, the three dined together again. Mrs. Larson had prepared feijoada, a hearty black bean stew, one of Mark's favorite foods. It was a Friday, and they decided to make it a tradition. Every Friday, family dinner, no talk of work, just connecting as mother and children. "Mother, can I ask you something?" Beatrice broke the silence as she served herself sliced orange. "Of course." "Have you really forgiven Matthew?" Helen looked at her son, who seemed to freeze at the question. "Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let resentment define me. Your brother made a terrible mistake, but he is striving every day to be better, and I choose to see that effort." "And me?" Beatrice pressed. "Have you forgiven me for running away?" "There was nothing to forgive. You did what you needed to do to survive the pain. I understand that because I did the same in other ways." Matthew finally spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive myself." Helen reached across the table and held Matthew's hand. "Then let me hold that forgiveness for you until you are ready to accept it." They finished dinner and moved to the library, where Mark used to read on Friday nights. Helen took out a bottle of red wine that had been stored, one of those he set aside for special occasions. She poured 3 glasses. "A toast," she raised her glass, "to new beginnings, to second chances, and to the family that chooses to stay united even when it would be easier to fall apart." "To family," Beatrice and Matthew repeated, and the three gently clinked their glasses. They talked late into the night, about their father, about childhood memories, about future dreams. Beatrice talked about Paris, about her academic life, about a French professor who seemed interested in her, but whom she kept at arm's length because she was still processing her grief. Matthew talked about therapy, about how he was learning to recognize patterns of manipulation, about a support group for men who had been in abusive relationships. Helen listened to everything, contributing when asked, but mostly letting her children express themselves. And as she listened, she realized they had grown, not in stature or age, but in depth, in understanding themselves and the world. When the clock struck midnight, the three were still there, laughing at an old story Beatrice was telling about a childhood prank. It was a light, healing laugh, like balm on wounds that were still sensitive, but already in the process of healing. In the following months, life found a new rhythm. The Sustainable Development Project advanced, facing technical and logistical challenges, but also gaining recognition. The specialized media began to cover the initiative, praising Montgomery Construction for innovating without losing economic viability. Beatrice divided her time between London and Paris, as planned. With each return, she brought new ideas, new connections, new energy. Matthew took on more and more responsibilities, but always with his mother's guidance, learning from successes and especially from mistakes. Helen, in turn, gradually began to delegate more. Not because she was weak or incapable, but because she recognized that holding on to everything was a form of control, not leadership. True leadership was about preparing successors, not becoming irreplaceable. On a sunny Saturday in July, exactly 1 year after the discovery of the conspiracy, Helen organized a special lunch at the mansion. She invited not only her children, but also old employees, close friends, Dr. Kennedy, even some competitors who, over the years, had become respectable. In the garden, under elegant tents, tables were arranged with wildflower bouquets. The food was abundant, lovingly prepared by Mrs. Larson and her team. Soft music played in the background. When everyone was gathered, Helen asked for attention. Standing with Beatrice and Matthew by her side, she raised a glass of champagne. "I want to thank everyone for being here," she began, her voice firm but emotional. "This past year has been transformative in ways I never imagined. We faced storms that almost destroyed us. But here we are, not just survivors, but renewed." Discreet applause, Helen continued. "I learned that family is not just about sharing blood, but about sharing values. It's about who stays when it would be easier to leave. It's about who forgives when it would be simpler to hold a grudge." She looked at her children with deep love. "And I discovered that my greatest legacy is not the buildings we built. It is the people we shaped." On a silent night, a widow returns to the old family mansion, unaware of what awaits her. Instead of welcome, she finds dark corridors, half-open doors, and a plan to remove her from her own history. But what seemed to be her end becomes the beginning of a revelation that will change everything. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. Matthew, without warning, took the floor. "I would like to say something, Mother." His voice trembled slightly. "A year ago, I almost destroyed everything. I was weak, manipulable, cowardly. But you gave me something I didn't deserve, a second chance. And I promise before everyone here that I will honor that chance every day of my life." Beatrice also spoke, "And I learned that running from pain doesn't make it disappear. It just waits. But facing it, with the support of those we love, transforms pain into strength." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Hugs were exchanged, stories were shared, laughter echoed throughout the afternoon. As the sun began to set, painting the London sky in shades of orange and purple, Helen found herself alone for a moment in the corner of the garden, observing everything. She felt a familiar presence beside her, not physical but unequivocally present. "Mark." She smiled. "We did it," she whispered to the wind. "Our family survived, and they will continue to build good things. You can rest in peace, my love." And at that moment, Helen Montgomery understood that victory was not about never falling. It was about getting up, dusting herself off, and moving forward with dignity, love, and hope. And as the sun set over London, illuminating the Montgomery mansion with its golden light, a new era began. An era of truth, unity, and legacies that transcended generations.